At 40, many believe they have already lived the best part of life.
But Carl Jung thought the opposite. For him, true existence only begins after 40. In this video, you will discover why the midlife crisis might actually be a spiritual awakening. What lies behind the silent collapse many people experience at 40, and how Jung teaches us to go through this phase, not as an end, but as a psychological rebirth. Maybe you're not losing your youth. Maybe you're finally finding yourself. Life really begins at 40. Before then, we are merely doing research. If this topic has already stirred something within you, a doubt, a discomfort, a silent calling, subscribe now, because what you are about to hear might change the way you understand your existence. And when that happens, you'll want to be here, when everything finally makes sense. The illusion of the beginning. From an early age, we are trained to see youth as the climax of human existence. Western culture glorifies the 20s and 30s as the best years of life, the peak of beauty, energy, and achievement. Movies, advertisements, and even family advice sell us the idea that everything that matters must happen before midlife: success, marriage, children, stability. This linear view of life turns 40 into a feared milestone, a sign that time is running out, that the best has already passed, that now it's all decline. This is the illusion of the beginning, the false belief that everything worthwhile must happen in the first half of life. Carl Jung challenged this vision with courage and depth. For him, youth is just a phase of preparation, not the peak, but the ground where the seeds are planted. In the first 40 years, we are busy building what he called the persona, the social mask we use to function in the world. We seek approval, success, belonging. We follow models imposed by others, parents, teachers, idols. But all of this, although necessary, is superficial. The persona is not the true self, it is a performance. And when that performance begins to crack, when we realize we've been living to please others, the illusion shatters. For the first time, we start to ask, what if all this isn't who I really am? This is the point at which many people experience what we call the midlife crisis. But what Jung proposes is that this collapse of the persona is not a sign of weakness, but of growth. It's not the end of a glorious phase. It's the beginning of a transformation. The collapse of the illusion is painful, but necessary, because as long as we cling to the idea that youth is the peak, we will be condemned to resist the true calling of adulthood, to become whole. The real crisis is not in growing older. It's in staying attached to an identity that no longer serves us. When we see midlife as a downfall, we miss the chance to perceive its true power. Jung invites us to flip this narrative. He tells us that true life begins exactly when the illusion breaks. At 40, we are not falling, we are waking up. The fall of the persona is not ruin, it is revelation. It is when we stop living according to someone else's script and begin to write our own. It is there, in the heart of disorientation, that the journey of the true self finally begins. And that is why Jung declared, with boldness and truth, life begins at 40. Before then, we are merely doing research. Jung described the first 40 years of life as a phase of existential experimentation. It's a period marked by attempts, errors, adaptation, and construction. During those initial decades, we dedicate ourselves intensely to forming what the world expects from us: a name, a career, an acceptable and desirable image. We seek security, recognition, belonging, all through a structure that often does not come from within, but is imposed upon us. It's a time when we struggle to be someone, yet we almost never stop to ask who that someone truly is. We live as if we are assembling a beta version of ourselves, constantly updated based on external reactions, praise, criticism, rewards. But we rarely look inward. It is in this phase that we build the persona, Jung's central concept representing the social mask we use to navigate the world. This mask isn't necessarily false, it's necessary. Without it, we couldn't function in society, but it is limited. It shows a part of us and hides all the others. In youth, we take pride in the persona. We want to be the best professional, the exemplary child, the ideal partner, the reliable friend. We wear the mask with pride, as a trophy of social adaptation. But over time, this adaptation begins to weigh heavily, and what no longer fits starts to generate silent anguish. After all, the more we wear the persona, the further we drift from what's behind it, our true self. During those years, we accumulate experiences, but also frustrations. We earn titles, but often lose touch with our most authentic desires. We try to fulfill expectations from family, culture, social media, and we confuse that with purpose. We work hard to climb a ladder, but when we look around, we often realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. This is the great risk of youth, mistaking activity for meaning and external success for inner fulfillment. Jung saw this phase as research, a necessary stage of gathering psychological raw material, relationships, wounds, victories, mistakes that would only later be used in the soul's true work. That's why the first 40 years should not be seen as a failure or wasted time, but as symbolic preparation. Just as an artist needs paint before painting, the human being needs life experience before finding themselves. Every wrong decision, every frustrated ambition, every identity we adopted and later abandoned, all of these are fragments that one day can be integrated. And it is precisely from 40 onward that this integration begins to become possible, not because we suddenly become wise, but because we finally have enough material to rebuild ourselves. The research ends, and the awakening begins. At some point, usually between the ages of 40 and 50, something begins to fracture, not violently or dramatically, but silently, like a crack that slowly spreads across an old wall, almost imperceptible at first glance. The persona, that mask we worked so hard to build in the first decades, begins to feel too heavy, too tight, too empty. The role we once played with pride no longer satisfies us. The career we fought to achieve no longer inspires. The stable relationship begins to feel lifeless. There is no clear reason for this emptiness, but it's there, and it grows. This is the moment that culture calls the midlife crisis. But Jung invites us to see it differently, not as a failure, but as a call to truth. What is collapsing is not our life. It's the illusion of who we believed we were. The fracture in the persona is the sign that the authentic self is trying to emerge. There is no manual for this. Sometimes it's a birthday that triggers the discomfort. Other times it's a moment of silence, a persistent insomnia, a tiredness that is not physical but existential. Then a haunting question arises. Is this it? Is this all there is? And that question, as uncomfortable as it may be, is a sign of life. It is the soul asking for space. It is the beginning of the process Jung called individuation, the slow and profound return to the center of oneself. But crossing through this portal requires courage. It involves facing discomfort, boredom, doubt. It involves confronting the shadow, everything we deny, repress, or forget. It is not uncommon, at this point, for people to change course, to abandon success for silence, stability for risk, image for what is real. And to the world, this seems like madness. But to the soul, it is liberation. The silent fracture is, in fact, an invitation. The collapse of the persona is not ruin, it is revelation. It is the end of the performance, the end of someone else's script. From here on, if we choose to listen to this calling, life begins to rewrite itself, no longer as a repetition of inherited expectations, but as a conscious creation. For the first time, we look inward, not to please, not to achieve, but to understand. And it is in this simple and radical gesture that the true birth of adulthood begins. Individuation, the process of becoming whole. Jung called individuation the true goal of adult life, to become what one is, not what the world expects, not what our parents dreamed, not what the persona projected, but what emerges from the depths of the unconscious when we silence the outer noise. Individuation is not a destination. It is a continuous process, sometimes painful, always transformative. It is the path back home, not to a physical house, but to the center of the self. A return that requires crossing internal labyrinths, facing old ghosts, and reintegrating forgotten pieces of oneself. This process begins with the rupture of the persona, but it does not end there. It demands that we face what we most avoid, our shadow. Jung saw the shadow as the reservoir of the unconscious, where we bury everything we do not accept in ourselves. Fears, impulses, desires, shamas, unspoken truths. But what is repressed does not disappear. It grows stronger in the dark. And one of the hardest steps in individuation is to stop running from what we are and begin to embrace it. This means recognizing that we are not only light, goodness, and rationality, but also anger, contradiction, doubt, and darkness. Not to be consumed by it, but to become whole. Individuation is, therefore, a deeply spiritual process, though not in a religious sense. It is spiritual because it requires surrender, detachment, transcendence. It requires dying to what we once were, so that something new can be born. And this symbolic death is often experienced as mourning, for the former identity, for old dreams, for lost certainties. But Jung knew that only through this passage can the authentic self be born, the one that no longer depends on external approval, that no longer needs to prove its worth, that is no longer trapped by the fear of rejection. And when this process begins, even slowly, even silently, something changes forever. Decisions start to come from another place. Life ceases to be a series of imposed goals and becomes an expression of being. Time ceases to be an enemy and becomes an ally. Midlife, then, is no longer a sign of loss, but reveals itself as the gateway to inner freedom. It is at this point that we begin to live, not to fulfill roles, but to honor the truth that pulses within us. And that truth, no matter how uncomfortable or imperfect it may be, is the only thing capable of setting us free. Comment below, I crossed the portal, if from today onward, you choose to leave behind the masks, illusions and fears and begin to live as who you truly are. The individuation journey proposed by Jung inevitably leads us to a shadowy territory, an internal place that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. To this place, he gave a simple yet powerful name, the shadow. The shadow is not something external, not the evil in the world, nor the flaws of others. It is within us. It is made up of everything we deny, repress, and are ashamed of. Our unaccepted impulses, our unhealed wounds, our inappropriate emotions, forbidden desires, hidden weaknesses. Everything our persona cannot admit ends up there. And the more we deny the shadow, the more it dominates us from behind the curtains of consciousness. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, it is not by avoiding pain that we grow, it is by going through it. The problem is that we have been conditioned to hide our flaws, to camouflage our insecurities, to appear strong all the time. But this constant performance comes at a cost. Little by little, we detach from ourselves. And when we finally begin to ask why we feel empty, it's because the shadow is already calling. It doesn't want to destroy us. It wants to be integrated, because it contains not only what is dark within us, but also what is authentic. Within the shadow are, for instance, unlived talents, silenced courage, desires we abandon to please others. There is anger, yes, but there is also truth. There is fear, but there is also sensitivity. When we look at the shadow with honesty, it stops being a monster and begins to reveal itself as an essential part of our humanity. Facing it requires courage. It often hurts. But it is precisely this confrontation that gives us back our power. Jung believed that only when we accept what we truly are, with all our light and darkness, do we become whole. In midlife, this calling intensifies. The masks no longer work as well. The persona begins to crack, and everything we avoided for decades starts to emerge. Old guilt, unresolved traumas, unspoken truths. It is a dangerous moment because many run away, but it is also a sacred moment because those who stay are reborn. The journey through the shadow is not the end of pain, but the beginning of truth. And with truth, finally, comes freedom. It is by illuminating this inner territory that we begin to realize what we reject in ourselves might be exactly what we need to become whole. In youth, we are driven by a restless fire. We want to prove something to the world, to our family, to ourselves. We chase visible goals, degrees, positions, salaries, status. We measure our worth by what we achieve and by the approval we receive. This phase, though exhausting, is often necessary. We need structure. We need to learn how to walk on our own. But at some point, usually between the ages of 40 and 50, this drive begins to empty. The race that once seemed meaningful begins to feel automatic. The trophies no longer shine as brightly. And what arises is what Jung described as a turning point. The questions change. Suddenly, we no longer ask, what can I achieve? But rather, what truly matters to me? This life I built, is it mine or was it inherited? What do I want to leave behind when I'm gone? These are not questions that can be answered in a hurry. They require silence, time, truth, and precisely because of that, they are frightening, because they imply the possibility of starting over. And who has the courage to start over at 40? Who is willing to look at everything they've built and say, this is not enough, or worse, this is not me? But it is exactly here that the journey of individuation deepens. We stop living to be admired and begin to live to be true. What once was about ambition now transforms into a search for meaning. We no longer want to impress. We want to feel. We no longer seek approval. We seek presence. And what once moved us, the desire for success, for recognition, to prove our worth, gives way to a simpler and more powerful question. What makes me feel alive? Jung believed this transition was inevitable for those who listen to their soul, and that those who ignore it, who try to extend youth forever, end up drowning in boredom, anxiety, and resentment. Because deep down, they know they are living a role that has already ended, and they refuse to leave the stage. But those who have the courage to walk through that door find something that youth, no matter how glorious, can never offer: inner peace, a sense of coherence between what is felt and what is lived, and perhaps for the first time, the freedom to be who you are, with no excuses, no masks, no fear. The individuation journey is not just a symbolic or philosophical process. It is also deeply embodied. As we move through midlife, important changes take place in our brain. Neuroscience studies show that the emotional centers, especially the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, begin to communicate in a more balanced way. This means we become less impulsive, less reactive, and more capable of reflecting before acting. Neuroplasticity, though slowed down, still operates, and now no longer to adapt us to external expectations, but to sustain a more centered, more present mind, better able to handle the complexity of existence. This brain maturity manifests subtly but powerfully. What once threw us off balance, criticism, failures, rejection, no longer carries the same weight. We develop a kind of expanded sense of time. We can look back with compassion and forward with serenity. Emotions no longer dominate us but are recognized as messages. Anxiety loses its grip because we are no longer trying to prove our worth at every moment. In its place arises the calm of someone who has finally understood that life is not a straight line, but a spiral always inviting us to return to the center. Curiously, this internal balance coincides with a natural distancing from social comparisons. Studies show that people between the ages of 40 and 60 tend to care less about what others think and more about what truly resonates internally. The search for meaning begins to outweigh the pursuit of status. And this is not just a change in values. It is the brain itself prioritizing deeper connections, more authentic decisions, more meaningful bonds. Biology begins to align with spirit. Carl Jung intuited this process long before science could measure it. For him, the second half of life required an interior reconfiguration. And today, we know that the brain silently also participates in this reconfiguration. It is as if, upon entering midlife, the body begins to prepare the mind for what Jung called the true work of life, to integrate who we are with who we can become. The brain matures, so the soul can awaken. Crossing midlife is often like watching a silent collapse. What once supported our identity begins to lose shape. Roles, beliefs, habits, relationships, everything comes under review. And although this may seem like a crisis, Jung saw this process as something necessary. The deconstruction of the false self. Not because it was useless, but because it had already served its purpose. What served us in youth, ambition, performance, adaptation, no longer fits the inner calling that now grows stronger. It is time to let go. And letting go, for many, is frightening. But it is only in this emptying that the new can emerge. This deconstruction is not only symbolic. Often, it is visible. People change careers and marriages, step away from old social circles. Other times, it is more subtle, a change in thinking, a refusal to keep pretending, a silence that was once unthinkable. Every choice we make to leave something behind is also a declaration of freedom. But this freedom does not come without pain. It demands we pass through the grief of who we were, accept that certain dreams did not come true, that certain versions of ourselves no longer fit. And this, although difficult, is also profoundly liberating. Jung spoke of the importance of letting go of who we think we should be to become who we truly are. This phrase comes alive in midlife. It is no longer possible to carry everything. There comes a moment when the emotional baggage is simply too heavy. And then, little by little, we begin to let go. Let go of the need for approval. Let go of the obligation to please. Let go of the idea that we need to be useful all the time. And what remains, when all of that falls away, is something simpler, but more true. A rawer, more intimate, more whole presence. It is in this internal space that real freedom begins to emerge. This freedom does not have the shine of youth, but it carries a strength that youth does not know. The strength of someone who has fallen and risen again, who has been lost and still chose to continue. Midlife is the fertile ground of reconstruction. It is the moment when we stop being shaped by the world and begin to shape the world from what we have discovered within. It is no longer about conquering, but about creating. And what we create at this stage is no longer based on the desire to control, but on connection, presence, and purpose. This is true freedom, to live without masks, without races, without the need to prove anything, simply to be with all that we are. After the deconstruction, after the masks fall away, something emerges that cannot be forced, only lived. Rebirth. Jung saw this stage not as a poetic metaphor, but as a real phenomenon of the psyche. A point where, for the first time, we stop merely surviving and begin to live with intention. No longer driven by the fear of failure or the need to fit in, but by the silent and deep desire to be at peace with who we are. It is as if life, for the first time, stops shouting and begins to whisper. And in that whisper, something awakens, a new kind of presence. This rebirth does not come with fireworks. It comes with silence, with simple mornings, with calm decisions, with a different kind of attention to time, to the body, to words. The past, which once felt like a burden, becomes fertile ground for meaning. The wounds do not disappear, but they stop bleeding. They begin to teach. And everything that once was a source of struggle, identity, success, appearance, belonging, dissolves into a kind of clarity that only those who have crossed the desert know. The clarity that truly living is not about controlling life, but about listening to it. It is at this moment that values shift. We no longer want to be the best. We want to be whole. We no longer seek to impress. We seek to touch. We no longer chase time. We walk with it. And for the first time, we feel what Jung so often emphasized, that life is not a ladder to be climbed, but a circle to be filled. A return, not to the past, but to the origin, to what is essential, to that which never stopped being inside us, but which only now can be heard. It is the moment when we discover that true maturity is not the end of youth, it is the beginning of authenticity. This rebirth is silent, but revolutionary, because it does not only change the way we live, but the way we exist. We become simpler and deeper, slower and more present. And that presence, when it is true, transforms everything around us. Relationships become more real, choices become lighter, time ceases to be an enemy and becomes an ally. And then we understand with a quiet intensity why Jung said, life really begins at 40, because it is only after everything collapses that we finally have the space to build ourselves. At 40, something invisible changes. The soul, once silenced by the demands of the world, begins to speak louder than the external noise. And whoever listens to this voice discovers a secret that few dare to face. Everything we have done up to now was preparation, research, rehearsal. Only now does the play begin, and there is no longer an audience, only truth. Jung knew this. That is why he did not fear midlife. He revered it as a portal, the exact point where we stop chasing meaning and begin to live from it. Life then does not end. It reveals its true face. But this revelation requires a choice, to continue on the known path or to cross the mirror. And whoever crosses it never returns the same, because they begin to see, truly see, what was hidden beneath the layers of the persona, beneath the roles, beneath the fears. At 40, the clock does not mark the time remaining. It marks the time that has finally arrived, the time to be, to accept, to integrate, and to live, no longer as a character, but as the presence that was always lurking, waiting for its turn to breathe. Some believe this was the end, but be careful, the war is not over yet. There are still things left unsaid. These two videos in front of you are not here by accident. And what if the shadow you fear the most is actually the key to your freedom? In the next chapter, we're going even deeper into the unconscious and revealing what Jung called the dark side of the soul and why facing it is the only way to become whole. You're gonna have to risk the click. So, which one will you choose?